So thank you for being here. I'm sure there are many other better things you could be doing with your time. So I really appreciate seeing you all here. I just want to start by giving a little information about sort of where this comes from. You know, we're hosting this as part of a kind of initiative called First Publics. And we're really excited to be hosting this conversation, our first of what we hope are a series of webinars on the politics of teaching, on teaching politics, on pedagogy and practice in the classroom. And First Public, since we launched, provides a space to explore just that, the politics, pedagogy, and practice of teaching as public sociology. We're driven by the recognition that Michael Burawoy has famously said students are our first and probably most captive public. And since we launched First Publics last year, we've been working towards creating that kind of space, a space for teacher scholars to engage in reflection and discussion of the politics of teaching and teaching as a vital form of public sociology. So it's in that spirit that I'm thrilled to be joined today for a conversation on teaching politics and the politics of teaching by four incredible scholars and innovative teachers who write and teach on institutional politics, social movements, labor organizing, party formation and party articulation, right-wing radicalization, climate change, carbon transitions across contexts and time, among other tremendously relevant and politically salient topics. So here on the panel, we have, and in no particular order, sort of Edwin Ackerman. Hola. Edwin Ackerman is Associate Professor and Undergraduate Director of Sociology and a Senior Research Associate in the Program on Latin American and Caribbean Studies and Sociology at Syracuse University. As a scholar, he uses comparative historical methods to understand how political identities are formed, articulated, and become operative. He has studied this process in a number of different cases through the trajectory of debates over illegal immigration in the US, the relationship between political economy and kind of political party formation in Latin America, and the rise of transnational right-wing mobilization against so-called gender ideology in Latin America and the US. He's also a prolific public sociologist who routinely publishes public-facing work and contributes importantly to public debate on these topics that he studies. He teaches courses on globalization, political economy, and political sociology. So thank you, Edwin, for being here. We have Johnny Lotesta. She's an assistant professor of sociology at Appalachian State. Johnny is a political and cultural sociologist who works on political parties, labor, social movements, public policy, and American politics. She's currently writing a book on the current crisis of representation in American democracy. And at App State, she teaches courses in political sociology, social movements, power and privilege, and the sociological perspective. She's a strong believer and a skilled practitioner of active and engaged learning, and her courses routinely feature opportunities to apply sociology to the world around us through activities like in-class debates, case studies, and op-ed assignments. And I'm hoping we get a chance to hear about some of that. Johnny, thank you. We also have Benjamin Bradlow. He's an assistant professor of sociology and international affairs at Princeton University. His first book, Urban Power, Democracy and Equality in Sao Paulo and Johannesburg, will be published in October 2024 with Princeton University Press. A little plug, you should buy it. I saw it at ASA on the table. It looks wonderful. I can't wait to read it. Congratulations. The book compares the politics of distribution in urban settings, urban public goods like housing, transportation in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and Johannesburg, South Africa, after their transitions to democracy. His current work examines industrial transitions from carbon in the global South. And like Edwin, Ben is a public scholar that routinely writes essays and sort of public-facing work in outlets in the US, South Africa, and elsewhere. Ben teaches classes on international development, urban sociology, and the sociology of climate change. Thank you, Ben, for being here. And last but not least is Cedric de Leon. Cedric is professor of sociology and labor studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Cedric has published many books, including recently Crisis When Political Parties Lose the Consent to Rule. I recommend it. And is about to publish a sixth book, if I have the numbers correctly, that has a lovely cover. Also saw it at ASA. Really good design, which is a historical account of independent Black labor organizations in the United States. He's an expert on race and labor in the US and a leading thinker in the study of political parties. Cedric is also an engaged public sociologist. He has been a labor activist and organizer. He's the former director of UMass Amherst Labor Center and writes and speaks in public venues often. He's also an award-winning teacher and mentor who thinks deeply and cares, whose care and thought on the politics of teaching are infectious. Cedric teaches courses in social theory, political sociology, organizing, and US labor history. So thank you all for being here. Thanks, Cedric. Also on the panel are two colleagues of mine, Sarah Shannon, who is a director of criminal justice studies and a professor of sociology here at UGA. She's the brain behind First Publics, and Steph Hannes, she's a wonderful graduate student here at UGA who works on family, relationships, aging, and the life course. She is the engine behind First Publics and this webinar, and she's also on the market. So please reach out. She's wonderful. Okay, before we get started, just a little bit about how we're organizing this conversation. I'd like to alert the folks in the room that we are recording this conversation. I think you probably got an alert as you signed on. Before we get started, I'd also like to let the attendees know that we're looking forward to Q&A. We have a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, so you can type your questions in there or queue for questions. You can submit questions and we'll be monitoring that. And I'll get the conversation going, but there will be ample time for engaging the panelists. So please do stick around for that. I think it'll be probably the best part of this day. So to get us started, Johnny, Cedric, Ben, Edwin, I wonder if you could speak a little bit to a kind of motivating question we've been grappling with here at First Publics, which is namely how to make sense of, on the one hand, this kind of relative disengagement in formal politics, formal institutional politics, say traditional party politics and elections among young people. And the fact that at the same time, it is young people, importantly, who are leading the way in activism around genocide, pro-Palestine, climate change, and other important topics. And so I wonder if you could comment on this disconnect, or perhaps a better way to talk about it is a kind of combination of fatigue and anger that we see among students on campus. Do these narratives of kind of disengagement and coupled with activism hold on in your experience on your campus? And how does this dynamic affect engagement or disengagement, if you will, in your classrooms and in your teaching? Johnny and Cedric, I wonder if one of you could start and then we'll open it up to others. I know it's a big question, but let's get started right away.
Cedric, do you want to start? Do you want me to?
Oh, why don't you go ahead, Johnny?
Okay. Yeah, so it's an interesting conundrum and one I've sort of been grappling with in my work with youth-led social movements. So, here at App State, it's interesting because in some ways, like when you're talking about this dynamic or this paradox of political disengagement or political apathy in comparison to recent spikes in protests, I think oftentimes we're talking about different populations. So there is sort of like a subset of students here at Appalachian who are very politically engaged, who are very organized, particularly around issues specific to our campus. Right, so actually the recently elected chair of the North Carolina Democratic Party, the youngest to ever hold that position, is an App State alum and was actually quite involved in organizing some protests in response to some decisions from our previous chancellor. So I think, one thing that I've noticed among my students is this sense of sort of a feeling of political efficacy around issues on campus or closer to home, but that doesn't always translate into local, state, or national politics. And so I think one of the things that we explore in our campus is how sort of things going on campus can be a microcosm or a place of experimentation for students who care a lot about sort of bigger issues that seem almost too broad to grapple. But yeah, it's an interesting tension. But I think it's fun to sort of talk these things through with students and see the ideas that they come up with. And oftentimes the way that I have observed them overcoming this like supposed paradox is by engaging in institutional politics in ways that are really embedded within just sort of like social life here, right? So we have a very high needs student population. We have a lot of students who struggle with homelessness and food insecurity. And so when we do exercises in the classroom, like let's develop a Get Out the Vote campaign, right? The way they do that is through like social provision. So anyway, that's just to say that I think young people have their own ideas and issues that they're interested about. Sometimes they just don't always make that immediate connection to how those local issues translate into broader political institutions.
Thank you, Johnny. Cedric, how does that compare with your experience on your campus?
Well, I mean, I really think that this is in large part the fault of political parties. If young people or anybody else, right, are not engaged in institutional politics, one need look no further than the fact that, for example, even the Democratic Party, which is supposedly the more progressive party in the two-party system in the United States, is is carried on a kind of benighted pro-Israel policy that has turned a blind eye to the occupation and to Palestinian suffering. And a number of my students are labor studies students. They're primarily rank and file union members, right? Union staff. They're working people, and you ask them about the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and for them, they haven't really attended to, the needs, desires, aspirations of working class people for generations. And so what you're seeing now is, for example, let's just take the labor movement as an example. You have this kind of like this moment of movement revitalization on the ground, right? Where workers are turning to unions, right? In numbers that I think are uh, really we haven't seen in decades. Okay, where we're living through a moment of labor movement resurgence right now. And I think you can say the same thing about the Palestine solidarity movement. Look, the BDS, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign has been around for a long time, right? Those of us who have been politically involved, I mean, that's a decades old political project. And it's happening now. Well, why is it happening now? Right? It's because there are folks who place their faith in the contemporary Democratic Party. I mean, there's very little kind of faith in the Republican Party to do anything beyond warmongering, but they've placed their faith in the Democratic Party that they were going to do something to bring about some resolution, a Palestinian state, and of course that's not happened. Quite the opposite, actually. There's been the enabling of the ultra far right wing of Israeli civil society, which the majority of Israeli civil society doesn't even like, right? And so what do our students do? What do our first publics do? Well, they see no room in the two-party system. There's no home in the two-party system for them, so they engage in the Palestine solidarity movement. That's the way that I make sense of the paradox.
Thank you so much, Cedric. Ben, I wonder if you could comment on this just briefly, because the students you teach might, at least on paper, seem to be different than the high need students that Johnny teaches or the working folks that Cedric is teaching. So what does that look like on your campus in this kind of privileged space of higher education where you are?
I think your characterization is largely correct. Though I know that the student body has actually changed to a meaningful degree over the last decade or so at Princeton. If you looked at through a measure of, for example, like Pell Grant eligible students, which was part of a concerted policy change in admissions about 10 years ago. And that's kind of been reflected in my experiences teaching here in a couple ways. One is that I think there's an increase of people from working class contexts, but the overall culture is certainly not that at Princeton. And so that I think that produces a certain kind of alienation that gets reflected in the class a bit and in student experiences. So that's kind of like a sociology of the classroom, but that's not a sociology of political participation among students. And the way that this all comes together for me is particularly in teaching about climate change with undergraduates, which I think it would be uncontroversial to suggest as an issue. This is an issue that has been subject to a lot of youth political engagement, and certainly I think that drives a lot of the interest in the class that I teach with undergrads. But what comes out, there are two things that I try to do in the class that I think at least kind of unsettle the established narrative around youth climate political engagement. The first is that it's a very domestically focused group of students that enter this kind of class, and the way that the course is crafted is very global and transnational, which I think is extremely appropriate for an issue like climate change, perhaps the only appropriate way of teaching effectively about climate change. And so the reception is quite open to. The second is this issue of, is climate change the issue to be organizing about? And something we talk about a lot in the class is the different kinds of social groupings that are involved in this issue and the kinds of coalitions that are relevant for making change on this issue. And what comes out is the key actor that very few students, if any, bring up at the beginning of the class, but becomes quite central by the end, is worker organizations and unions. And this is an actor that's not seen as central to climate organizing as an issue. But when we think about the broader dynamics of what is being targeted when you do climate policy and think about climate as a programmatic political problem, then work organization, organized labor becomes perhaps the central social actor or mass actor that students kind of coalesce around by the end of the semester. So I think this, in a way, this maybe builds off of what Cedric is talking about, that the union movement is something that I think is not very present, perhaps different to what Cedric was talking about in his context, is not very present in the context where I'm teaching, but it becomes very present through the classroom.
Thank you, Ben. You know, you're talking about climate change as a global issue, and Cedric addressing, for example, that, you know, anti-occupation, divestment movements have a long history. Sort of makes me think about a kind of another important dynamic that we've been sort of grappling with here, which sort of has to do with how to kind of historicize and sort of bring a global perspective sort of into the classroom around contemporary political issues. And I wonder, maybe I'll turn this question over to Edwin, but I suppose one of the ways we might think about this is, like, to be sure, we're living in an important contemporary moment, right? The politics right now, the fact that sort of over 50% of the population is participating or has an opportunity to participate in consequential elections this year, the movements that we're seeing, the resurgence of the labor movement are contemporary import. But we also have this, and those might be relevant and exciting for students to engage, but we also have this kind of pedagogical imperative to provide our students with a historical and comparative sensibility. So I guess I wonder, Edwin, if you can help us think through how you might do that in the classroom. I know you're constantly thinking comparatively and historically, and so how do you bring that into the classroom and sort of help the students relate to a historical and comparative context?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very interesting question. And actually, I'm going to try and see if I can tie this a little bit to the previous question as well. Because one of the things I was thinking about as I was hearing the other panelists here is that there is a general context in U.S. society outside of the universities of relatively low political engagement, right? Like whole question of declining civil society or the declining role of parties as articulators, generally speaking, low voting rates in the past, at least in the sort of neoliberal period in the U.S., right? So that's a general context in which students, in this sense, are not necessarily an exception, right? Now, that said, there are important differences, I think, that I've noticed in the 8 years that I've been teaching, which sort of interestingly are split between two presidencies, right? And so in my experience, I started teaching fall of 2016. So that's the election of Donald Trump. I taught the very next day, when everything was sort of gloomy, etc. And I also noticed from the get-go there a sort of change in the approach, the interest that students had in the text that I was assigning, in the questions that were being posed, that lasted basically through the Trump years, right? In a sense, the sort of discussions of texts that can be 100 years old, but are talking about fascism or authoritarianism or threats to them. It just seemed to be much more readily obvious why we were reading them. There was also a sort of interesting symbiosis, if you will, in the best case scenario, with media that was also framing it in those terms, right? In terms of right-wing populism or in terms of sort of potential threats of fascism. Even if the task at the classroom was to complicate those concepts, right? There was this sort of symbiotic relationship between an interest created in general outside of the classroom and then mimicked in the classroom. And then all of that, in my experience, ended swiftly in 2020, right? So it's the pandemic, yes, but it's also the beginning of the Biden presidency, which, one of the things it promised and I delivered was that we weren't going to care about politics anymore, right? People were going to go back to brunch, right? As to reference that famous tweet or whatever. So that happened, unfortunately, in the classroom, in my experience, right? The first a few years after the pandemic, 2020, 2021, really difficult years for teaching. And I think this is, from what I've talked to colleagues, this is just as a general trend. And again, it had to do a lot, obviously, with the pandemic, but I think it was in addition to that, there was a certain political exhaustion, in the sense also of, political hopelessness, if you will, because I also remember that towards the beginning of the pandemic, we also had the Bernie Sanders phenomenon that was sort of strong in the university, right? So there was this sort of general energy, right, that got lost. And yeah, the years after that, the years of the Biden presidency have been an uphill battle in terms of engagement, and I'm talking about here classroom engagement, right? I'm not even talking about whether students are politically engaged outside. I'm just talking about whether they react, become interested in the topics that we're discussing. And interestingly or ironically, one of the areas that tends to elicit a lot of attention in my experience in the Biden presidency is a whole section on atomization and individualization in politics. In other words, the opposite of collective agency, right? It's basically an entire section devoted to theories of sort of Francis Fox Piven's "Why Americans Don't Vote." That sort of discussion ends up resonating with students in my experience. Now, the other thing that does resonate, I think, or I try and emphasize, is precisely what you were asking me. This question of thinking of the U.S. as a case study is how I would think about it. And I think the pedagogical benefits of it are twofold. Are, on the one hand, that you are able to think of what happens in the U.S. in a much more formally causal way, right? Because by setting up the U.S. as a comparative case, you're allowed to better ask causal questions, right? Why is it that this happened here and not somewhere else? Versus when you're just looking at something within one particular country, just feels like it just happens, right? It's just some sort of chronological sequence of history that produces it, and there's no, in a sense, social determinants, right? But it also, I mean, comparison also allows to pinpoint what's specific about the U.S., right? So even if the point of the comparison is to say nothing like this happens, you're able to draw out the specificity of that only through the comparative case, right? And so let's say if I say something like the U.S. The contemporary Republican Party is built on a coalition between free marketeers and social conservatives, that becomes a clearly distinctive phenomenon once you compare it to the right wings of other countries, right? In which that particular link didn't necessarily occur, right? And so it gives you an insight into the U.S., even though you're looking at something other than the U.S., right? So yeah, I would stop there, but that's how we try and connect some of the issues here.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Edwin. And then I would argue that by pointing students to these contingencies and causal mechanisms also opens up space for understanding where you can intervene in politics, right? So it might also add some hope or some antidote to disengagement. I'm not sure, but my experience resonates with yours in kind of the Biden period. So thank you for sharing that. Johnny, Cedric, or Ben, do you want to add a bit to this conversation about historicizing or comparing in the classroom and yet engaging this political moment? Ben, and I see Cedric, yeah?
Yeah, just a small point that struck me while Edwin was talking about that, which is I think students enter the classroom with a kind of a view of politics, particularly American politics, that's shaped by how the mainstream press reports on American politics, which is basically as a series of unpredictable events that are just kind of playing out as a reality show. And this kind of this causal arrangement that Edwin was referring to, I think that's quite a novel way of thinking about politics when that sociology really provides. But I think it's worth kind of underscoring that and stating that explicitly, that this is not something that students enter into the classroom. And it's one of the main added value, if you will, of the sociology classroom for thinking about politics, to move beyond this kind of like totally unpredictable series of unconnected events, which I think, especially if you start with fall 2016, that was the mainstream view of the Trump presidency, that this was in effect an exogenous shock that came out of the blue.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Cedric, you wanted to add something?
Sure. I'm going to go in a different direction, though I agree with both Ben and Edwin about, the importance of comparison and kind of sharpening our analysis of what is happening right now in the place where we live, right? And that is a comparison to one's own campus, right? If we're trying to engage First Publics, how are we incorporating our lived experience at the university they attend? And so one of the ways that I try to do this is to basically anchor what is, often theoretical, dense, abstruse material to what is happening around them, right? So I have a module in my Intro to Theory class that is on settler colonialism, but that's not what I call it. I call it Welcome to the Pioneer Valley, because that's what they call Western Massachusetts, the Pioneer Valley. What does that mean? What does it mean that UMass Amherst is a land grant institution? Whose land was it before it became a land grant institution, right? We can talk about George Floyd, right? And the ways in which, the racial reckoning after the 2020, summer insurgency, and the ways in which settler colonialism in Palestine, Israel are affecting institutional politics. Or we can talk about the fact that the UMass Police Department has engaged in, quite aggressive practices in arresting students, in racially profiling them, and so forth. And it is in this way, right? There's a distinctive way of engaging our First Publics, right? But in kind of like bringing the politics home, right? Tip O'Neill is credited with the notion that all politics is local. And I think that while that might not be true, and the empirical data says more and more that our local elections and state elections are impacted, right, by the national partisan framework, right, that organizes, for example, the 2024 election. Nevertheless, I think that if we're worried about the disengagement of our students, perhaps one thing that we could do is compare, the objects of inquiry, the issues, the social problems that we talk about in sociology, have them compare it and contrast it to their own lived experience on our campuses. I've found tremendous success with that. And the thing is like, I'm not beating them over the head. I'm not saying vote for Joe Biden. I'm really not. I'm pointing them to, for example, like, there's a monument that sorry, I'll do another anecdote. The seal of the University of Massachusetts Amherst was until last year an indigenous person with a sword hanging over his head. That was the seal of the university, right? I mean, it's like a settler colonial emblem, right? And so, again, I mean, I could assign a bunch of readings on Palestine and Israel. I could do that. But we could also talk about, comparatively speaking, the same set of issues, social dynamics, processes, and forms of institutional power that are happening now, right, in front of our eyes, not back in the day, right? Not right. We don't have to talk about Christopher Columbus. We can talk about the seal of the university.
Oh, Cedric, that's so great. Thank you so much for sharing that. One of the things we like to do here at First Publics, and we sort of pride ourselves for, is not just having kind of reflexive conversations about the politics of teaching, but giving people good ideas, for what they can actually do in the classroom. And this is super helpful. So both Edwin's notion of taking the US as a case and thinking comparatively and causally, sort of getting outside of the media narratives and kind of the narratives that sort of folks come into the classroom with about US politics as a series of kind of unpredictable events, as Ben said, but also the notion of taking the university itself, the classroom itself, as a case study to understand big complex things like settler colonialism is super helpful. So thank you all for sharing that. And I suppose in that spirit, I'd welcome other panelists to share kind of useful things you do in the classroom. I know you do it because I've talked to you about it. I don't know, Johnny, for example, I wonder if you could share some of the kind of practices. We'd love to see you in the classroom doing what you do so well.
Yeah, so I took notes as Cedric was talking, thinking like, oh, I could totally do this at App. And actually the university just digitized a bunch of records. That would be really fun to do something like that with. Anyway, yeah, so I mean, I think that I often approach this by trying to create assessments and assignments where students sort of do the problem solving and the organizing themselves. Now, as of yet, I haven't had an opportunity to design this in a way where students are actually able to sort of implement their organizing plan. So it's all sort of still at the planning stage. So that'll be the version of the classes 2.0 will be actually designing, implementing, and then assessing an organizing plan over the course of the semester, hopefully alongside our research methods and capstone students to do some data analytics in any way. But to put this more briefly, so I teach political sociology every fall, which means every other year I get to teach it during an election, which is super fun. And so as we get closer to the election, we turn to sociological literature on inequalities in democratic participation, right? And so a key takeaway from that is age and class differences in rates of participation, which have all of these sort of, we could argue, negative sort of democratic effects. Then we do a day on political socialization, how is it that we come to be politically engaged or not, and how do we sort of form our political opinions, with a focus on youth socialization and the stuff that youth social movements are doing right now to try to educate and engage young voters and young activists. Then we have a whole day where the students work together to develop a get out the vote strategy based on sociological theory and research, and then they present it to their peers, and we sort of vote, or we have panel of judges who decide okay, this is the best strategy. And then following the election, the class after the election, we read Cedric's Crisis, and we sort of investigate right, this problem of disarticulation, or when parties lose the consent to rule. And so you have this parallel of where we've just been studying sort of disengagement and thinking about how do we get people more engaged. We observe an election and then we sort of process the outcomes of that election and our hopes for the next administration or administrations, sort of in light of like what I feel like is a book that very much reflects the sentiment of many of my students, which is like, none of this represents me. I don't give my consent to any of this, but I also don't have a great option. And that sort of opens up a space for a conversation about like, well, what do we do from here? And it's interesting because the conversation, the two times I've done it, does sort of have like an ominous tone. But having just engaged them in developing a get out the vote strategy, like sort of they're having this sort of more theoretical conversation about democratic representation through two major parties in conversation with the work they just did together to think about like, okay, what would actually be a strategy to get people politically engaged here on campus? And so there's always sort of like that thread of hope there where they're like, well, no, but I think what we proposed was really different than what, for example, the Democratic Party here does, which like, you know, it's sweet, but like there's basically little old ladies like, you know, asking people to vote like in front of the library, which is like really sweet, but is not really engaging young people as political agents themselves, right? So that is an exercise that I really enjoy doing. I'm excited to see how it works out this semester.
Great. Thank you, Johnny. These are fabulous ideas. I'm going to invite you all to write them up for us for First Publics, but I won't ask you for another. Well, I won't do another big ask just yet. We're still in this. I want to open it up for questions, but I have another question. I have so many questions, but I have one that I'd like to pose, which we are sort of having this conversation, not just in the context, literally kind of in the wake of, you know, party conventions and in the context of elections and campus protests, but we're also having this conversation in the context of kind of right-wing fueled anxieties and discourses about, you know, that are anti-university, anti-so-called critical race, anti-DEI, and frankly, anti-sociology. And so I wonder if you could comment on the degree to which you have faced any kind of political or institutional constraints or backlash in your teaching, and if so, have you navigated it? And I ask this question with full recognition that all of us sitting in this room are quite privileged in our teaching positions, quite protected institutionally, unlike most instructors of sociology across the country. So I say that all of us sitting with quite some resources and protection, but nevertheless, I think it's important to address that from your experience. I don't know, Edwin, if you have some thoughts about that or how you've faced that context.
Yeah, I can say a couple of things. I mean, I haven't experienced anything personally. There are colleagues, not necessarily in my department, but in my university that have sort of gotten into some sort of degree of trouble after tweets and so forth. I also think there's been a couple of moments in the past years where at least, to the degree that I'm familiar with it, the university seemed to act in the right way, sort of defending the right to free speech of faculties that got into a bit of trouble with right-wing media and so forth. In a sense, the short answer to this is that disengagement that I was talking about also manifests in this sense, in that there is, in my experience, no real pressure from, let's say, from right-wing students or right-wing organizations. In my experience, I obviously am aware of all these other instances that have taken place across the country. But what I would say, I mean, in a more general way, I guess, is that I do think, that we have this specific responsibility in these moments of deep political tension, to think seriously about what our role is there in the classroom. And I think, however, that the role, in my opinion, of the classroom is different than that of the op-ed and different than that of the journal article, let's say, right? And here, I sort of take a cue from Baber's famous essay on politics as a vocation, where he says at the beginning, this is a lecture given in 1919 in Munich, right? And all the students there are there waiting for him to take a position on the existing conjuncture, right? And he says instead something like, you're all going to come out of this disappointed because that's not what I'm going to do in this lecture. Instead, he's going to try and develop this sort of general notions, general patterns to Western politics, right? General concepts. In other words, these tools for analysis. And I think conceives of that as the political intervention itself in the classroom, right? I say in the classroom because the classroom, again, as opposed to the op-ed or the journal article, you have, as you were saying at the very beginning, a captive audience, right? You have power over them because you assign grades, right? And it's easy, I think, to forget that you are there not because of your general opinions on things, but because of a sort of claim of expertise on a specific subfield of study, right? And so the responsibility, in my opinion, is to remember that that's why you are in front of the classroom, right? But that doesn't mean, of course, that there is no political responsibility. But the political responsibility as a teacher, in my opinion, is to provide these general tools for analysis. That is, that the transmission of expertise in the subfield is in a sense the specific political intervention. Now, obviously, I'm not suggesting here that we can be objective or neutral, right? I don't think it's possible, and I don't think it's desirable, right? Sort of easy to be nonpartisan in the classroom, but in a deeper sense, of course, there's no point in asking the questions that sociology poses if it isn't in the service of justice in some sort of broad sense, right? But I think that the aim could be something like, moving away from, or at least I try and do that on my end, move away from statements that are opinions to statements that are, for lack of a better term, falsifiable, right? In the sense that there's evidence that can be brought for or against them, right? So that's how I would think, of the role of the teacher in these moments of political conflict.
Wow, thank you, Edwin. I was going to stop there, but I'm provoked to ask one final impossible question before I open it up, which is, and I open this up to anyone, any takers. So Edwin has shared what he thinks the political responsibility of teaching is. And I wonder if anybody would like to add to that or share what they think is their political responsibility in the classroom. Cedric, I know you have some thoughts on this. I don't know if you'd like to share them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in general, I'm persuaded by Paulo Freire on our responsibility to create a space and use pedagogies through which our students come to see themselves as agents of social change, as opposed to people who simply accept authority. I don't think that is distinct from what Edwin just said, because the capacity to use tools of analysis, right, is something that, an active, agent in one's own life, right, and one's community would want to employ. So I think I would say that's the sort of like guiding principle, but it's also it's something that a lot of progressive educators already embrace. I would say one other thing, which is I don't know if it's a political responsibility. It might be, but I think one thing that I take very seriously, and the thing that I love so much about my job, is actually to mentor people. And that may have political consequences that we never see, right? But for example, I'm very proud to say that I met with Ben Barlow in the Blue State on Thayer Street in Providence many, many years ago. I met with Edwin at UMass Boston at the Social Theory Forum many years ago. And I mean, Johnny and Diana and I are good friends going way, way back. And so, but like, what does that mean? Politically, what does that mean to create a community of interest, to sit down with, a young scholar and ask them, what do they think? What's their vision? What do they want to do with their profession, with their life? How do they see the world? And I think even though that might not be overtly political, right? In the sense of like, I'm not like I didn't hand any of you a clipboard, at least not to my imagination, go out there and canvas or knock on some doors. I didn't do any of those things. But I think hopefully I modeled a form of engagement with one's students that the people who I've had the pleasure and privilege to interact with, and all. I mean, I should say as an aside, I'm just so thrilled to be on the same panel with all of you. I mean, it's a really beautiful thing. My heart is warmed. But I do wonder about the sort of unintended political consequences of deep mentorship.
Thank you, Cedric. And thanks for enacting this politics of care and paying it forward. Ben, you have your hand up, and then we'll turn it over to so I see some questions popping up already.
Yeah, I hesitate to follow Cedric on that because it's such a I so agree, and it's such a it's a very touching way to talk about what's happening on this panel too. But I mean, one thing that strikes me perhaps across both of the last two comments, and I really don't want to be mistaken for taking too kind of like conservative in a lowercase c way position, but I think what a lot of the way that the kind of, dare I say, bourgeois sensibility that people enter into, that many students enter into the classroom with about politics is fundamentally expressive. That is, I want to arrive at opinion, and then the goal is to express the opinion a million times. And I think instead this kind of focus on the link between action and analysis suggests that the more kind of Weberian tools that Edwin was describing should make the classroom a space where it's not just about taking a position, which is in and of itself quite a leap for a young person to take, but to have tools to consider what are the actions and strategies and coalitions that are associated with taking that position. And so I see it as my role in the classroom guiding discussion to not be adjudicating what is the right or wrong opinion, but to at least tease out the implications of, if you take this opinion, well, what does that mean for the kinds of things that you do with that opinion?
Thank you so much, Ben. I see a question I will turn over to Steph, but I see already Jed.
Yeah, hi. Oh, there's no camera, I guess. I don't know how to. Anyway, you can hear me, right?
Yeah, we can hear you just fine. Thank you.
It's a bad picture. Anyway, um, uh, I really enjoyed these comments, particularly the one about falsifiability. When I was an undergraduate, uh, I was taught Karl Popper, the logic of scientific discovery, and that's the falsifiability theory. And I recently read a book by Samuel Moyn called Liberalism Against Itself, which raises the question, if you throw out everything that isn't falsifiable, what's left? What tools do you have left to use in political discussion, in politically relevant discussions or work, or activist activist proceedings? For example, and the answer is very little. So that what seems to happen, there's a danger, let's put it this way, there's a danger that we will spend all our time trying to establish what reality is in a falsifiable sense, and that we will never get around to asking the question, what should reality be? And if we ever get there, then how do we get there? So those questions are sort of punted out of sociology, and it's not even entirely clear to me how effectively the policy scientists are dealing with them. There is this reflexive sociology that George Steinmetz was telling me about a couple of years ago at one of the meetings, and that's represented by, I guess, Lake LeCointe, who you probably know his work. He teaches at Berkeley. I've never met him, but I read one of his books, something, an introduction to reflexive sociology, which includes a part from Bourdieu. Bourdieu assumed the idea of reflexive sociology. Anyway, if you just limit yourself to falsifiable thinking, and that thinking is what got me kicked out of graduate school, and why I never had my work recognized at all.
Thank you.
Anyway, but that thinking was, if you can't count it, if you can't falsify it, it's not sociological, it's not scientific, we aren't interested in it anyway. And that's very unfortunate, because so we spend all our time establishing that inequality exists rather than measuring it, and then we ignore the data which shows that coming from the Federal Reserve, which shows exactly how unequal the wealth distribution is.
Yes. Thank you so much, Jed. This is a useful intervention for us to think through. Let me take one more question, and then we can open it up back to the panelists. Edna has a question.
Oh, there. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. I was trying to get off of mute. So my question is, I should give this a little bit of a disclaimer, but I'm currently a master's student in sociology, and I'm an immigrant from West Africa. And for me, looking at the American political system, I'm constantly shocked by how surprised the populace is about when politicians and their donor and the donor class choose themselves over the population. And so I've grown to a point of apathy and almost disengagement. And I'm just voting as a reflexive action just to do it because I have the ability to do it since I became a citizen. But I don't really know what I I have very, very, very low expectations of our political system. I find it comical sometimes when we exceptionalize ourselves and we look at other countries and say they're failed democracies and there's corruption. It's like America is also a failed democracy and there's massive corruption here. It's just more sophisticated and hidden, like, better. So I don't know, as a student, as like a student citizen, what am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to expect of my fellow citizens when it feels like we've been deliberately uninformed, misinformed, and we're withheld from actually holding our elected officials accountable? Like, I feel like there's no accountability. Like, I can't fire people if they do bad things. It's allegedly I can do it by my vote, but clearly that doesn't always work the way it's supposed to. The like levers that are in place to protect us have been corroded. And so I'm afraid, and apathy seems the only way to like cope. And that's for a lot of students that I talk to. Like, we're terrified because if we engage, the disappointment facing us is like massive. Like, we're looking at the collapse of our economic systems. We can't buy houses. Like, it's just very disheartening.
Thank you, Edna. Yes, if anyone would like to respond, Johnny, I see your hand was up.
Yeah, I just thank you, Jed and Edna, for those thoughtful reflections and questions. And I was just sort of, something Edna said made me think of this, which may actually get at both questions or both comments. So, that apathy is real, and I have, my students have also shared this sentiment that it's a sort of form of self-protection or self-preservation. Thinking again to what our political responsibility is in the classroom, one way I have thought about this and tried to approach this is to think about my responsibility as not just historicizing or not just treating the United States as a case, but also problematizing. Because I share with Edna this observation that, right, there is this, in some ways, this sense of American exceptionalism that can permeate at least my campus in a way that doesn't really resonate with the reality of politics as we have been experiencing it the last 6 to 10 years. And so the way that I approach that is to always ask questions and to try to present, my students are, many of them are first generation students, many of them are Americans from North Carolina, born and raised. And so I see one of my tasks is asking questions, both in terms of like, how did things come to be this way? And how could we imagine them to be different? And I think that's where the sort of engaged learning and applied learning can be really helpful, because it invites an opportunity to get at exactly that question that Jed was raising, which is like, okay, so if we don't like what currently exists, what can we do about it? And so, yeah, I mean, I think that for me, the only anecdote that I've been able to find, and I would love to hear other people's thoughts, is to just keep asking questions and then try to walk with students while they try to develop their own answers.
Yeah, if I can say something quickly about these questions, particularly what Jed brought up. I think, yeah, as I was sort of saying in my previous comment, my suggestion, of course, isn't that, that you could or it would be desirable for the teacher to be neutral or objective, whatever that means. Fundamentally, because again, the whole reasoning underpinning sociology as a historical project is premised on the idea that social justice in some capacity is the objective, right? So all the questions that are posed, all the research questions, all the readings and so forth, the internal debates, internal scholarly debates are all ultimately, gravitating around that specific center. But I think awareness of that fact adds to this sense of responsibility, I think, because ultimately that overall, let's call it value judgment framework that sits, that underpins all the readings that you put forth in a syllabus, that ends up being an executive, in the classroom, ends up being an executive decision of the instructor, right? And so there is no way of not making that decision, right? In other words, there is no way of not having, let's call it a left or liberal or progressive, in some basic sense, syllabus, right? Because that decision, again, of what is to be desired for society has to be, again, an executive decision of the instructor. But that adds to the responsibility, right? Again, of being in front of them.
Thank you, Edwin, and thank you, Johnny. I see a question in the Q&A. And this comes from Emily Tingle. Any suggestions for concrete assignments or classroom activities where we can facilitate moving from policies close to home or politics close to home to connections back to the macro? Any suggestions for go-to texts that students enjoy that get them to grapple with the big questions, find solidarity through their experiences of others? Students also seem very attached to specific policies close to home. How might we encourage them to broaden their horizons? Many sociologists tell us to keep politics out of the classroom. How might we combat this criticism when our main point is to provide students, as Ackerman suggests, with the tools for analysis? How might we best communicate that goal to students? So there are a bunch of questions there, but I wonder if someone could take at least one of them up. Cedric, please.
Yeah, thanks for your comment and your questions, Emily. What I like to do is just to use the example I was using earlier about the UMass seal, as I do a kind of warm up of about 10 to 15 minutes at the beginning of class, where let's say I show the UMass seal or some other sort of on-campus thing, item, event, what have you. And I ask them, so what's going on in the seal? Why would this be the seal? This seems like an awfully strange thing to represent. I mean, to be the symbol of the university, etc. We have that conversation, right? It's not a super complicated conversation, but it really kind of pulls folks in to the general topic, because we're going to talk about settler colonialism. But I do a kind of warm up that way, and then we might read. Then we might transition to the reading itself, and the reading is generally kind of it's theoretical, it's kind of big picture, it's comparative in the sense that Ben and Edwin were talking about earlier. So something like Patrick Wolf's famous essay on genocide, for example, or Glenn Coulthard's critique of the politics of recognition, where you had like countries like Canada, for example, issue formal apologies to their indigenous populations for committing genocide centuries ago or 50 years ago, as the case may be. And so we get into kind of like the general, we move into this kind of like general theoretical, researchy kind of like conversation. And we do some like takeaway points at the end, but then what I like to do at the end of a module, let's say it's the settler colonialism module, is I then have students actually lead discussion on the readings as they relate to on-campus issues. And I'm not leading that. I mean, I'm just, I'm kind of off to the side, and they're really kind of, they're asking the discussion questions and so forth. And so in some ways, right, over time, as we move through the module, they come to sort of like take ownership of some of these issues, and they become practiced at these ideas, and they learn to play with those ideas, right? So that they become their own, they become the tools, right, that Edwin was talking about earlier, right? That's kind of, I mean, that's just an example. That's just one class. That's intro to theory. I could talk about other things too, but I think that might be the one most like best pitch to the general kinds of teaching that we might do in a college university setting.
Thank you, Cedric. Other questions? As people are warming up, I'd invite, Ben, I was just going to say, I'd invite our panelists to ask each other questions, or Ben, would you like to add something? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I just feel like this keep politics out of the classroom thing, like, we're talking about political sociology, that would be, I think it would be professional malpractice to keep politics out of the classroom. But again, I think the way I understand this playing out, not just in public debate, but the way this kind of gets framed among colleagues in the disciplinary sociological profession, I think what is being meant is an expressive mode versus an analytical mode. And this is a tough one because it's a kind of like for many people it becomes like it when you see it. What is the distinction between an expressive mode and an analytical mode? But what I want to underscore is I think that there actually are some time-tested tools, and really the historic heart of sociology that can help us to define what this line is between the expressive mode and the analytical mode. And what we shouldn't use the analytical mode to be is a cudgel against politics in the classroom. The point is rather to say that politics must be in the classroom. That is what sociology is. But that the politics must be in the classroom in the way that they're empowering beyond the expressive mode, and that it's linking to action in various forms. An action that's purely expressive is not the only form of action informed by sociological imagination. So I hope I'm not kind of putting this in too abstract terms, though we're amongst sociologists here, so I think it's okay. But that, I think in thinking about sociological education, we should not kind of cut off all our limbs before we enter the classroom and say that we don't bring politics into the classroom. That is what we're doing in the classroom.
Thank you, Ben. I find that to be a very helpful formulation, the expressive and analytical. So thank you. Johnny.
Yeah, I think so. And I think maybe just to build on what Ben was saying, I agree. I like that distinction between expressive or analytic, or I think someone else made the distinction between making an argument or taking a position in front of your class versus like puzzling through questions and engaging in an analysis with your class. I do just want to sort of like hold space for a moment, though, for the reality of some of us who are working in states and institutions where academic freedom is truly being rolled back legally. And so, some of that is just starting to happen here in North Carolina. I know Diana, Sarah, and Steph, you're in Georgia. And so, I can just speak from my general understanding, at least here at Upstate, maybe at the UNC system more broadly, it's still sort of like an open question about what this will mean for engagement in the classroom. So we've had some system level changes, including defunding and sort of de-labeling diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts across campus. I don't think the technical language is banned, but essentially banning or prohibiting programming that specifically engages issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then in addition to that, a compelled speech ruling that is quite broad. So the language says something like, students, faculty, and staff cannot be compelled to opine on issues of, contemporary debate. And so it's an open question about, well, does that apply to my classroom? How do I teach even an intro to sociology class without having students opine on gender as a social construct, or at least consider it, right? And so, I guess I just wanted to hold space to recognize that that is happening. If people are interested, I mean, for me, I have tried to deal with that using us as in some ways a sort of jiu-jitsu move. So this comes alongside like new policies at the university for protection of free speech, which of course are written because you don't want conservative students to feel like they're being silenced or marginalized in the university. So I use that same language in my syllabi, and we discuss it at the beginning of my class, right? Because it's a protection for all speech, including my speech or the questions or topics we cover in my classroom. And then the other way that I navigate it is to phrase things as open questions and to try to engage in ground rule exercises with my students throughout the course, where at the beginning of the semester, and again, partway through the semester, we revisit values that guide how we engage with each other in the classroom and how we talk to each other. And one of those values, the students always volunteer it, is respect. And then that opens up a conversation for, well, what does it mean to have respect? And one of the things I try to encourage among students by modeling is that respect for opinion doesn't mean that you treat all viewpoints as equally valid. It means, you respect the individual, you don't engage in aggressive or sort of retaliatory remarks, right? But we can be respectful while still critiquing the sort of logic, reasoning, and evidence base of arguments. And so it's a sort of a principle we try to return to. And so when I'm teaching something, we don't just discuss what's the content, we discuss how is this argument being made? On what basis is the author making this claim? And it provides a model for students to follow in the classroom. And it sort of allows you to discuss these issues while sort of in some ways, sidestepping, the argument that you're being too political.
Thank you so much, Johnny. It's absolutely true. And it resonates with us here in many places. And actually one of the reasons we're hosting this conversation in this moment is because we thought it might be useful for folks to listen to each other and think through actual things that we do. And this kind of language and revisiting principles and sort of working against some of these policy impositions are really helpful for us those of us that are planning courses now and thinking about how we might model the kind of engagement we want to see. So thank you. Other questions in the room, or I welcome panelists. Michelle,
Hi, can everybody hear me?
we can.
Yeah, thank you for the comments from all the panelists. I really appreciate it. Find them really insightful. And I have a brief comment and would love any reactions that any panelists might have to it. And the backdrop for my comment is my own context, which is at one of the UCs in UC San Diego specifically, where last quarter these questions were really brought to the forefront in my teaching like they had never been before, right? So I generally teach students that tend to be anywhere from center left to radical left, And so for the most part, I'm sort of preaching to the choir in terms of the content of my sociological classes. But this past quarter, the polarization around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was very much present in my classroom. And so I did have, a majority of students that sympathized with the protests and the encampments, a small number of students that were actively involved in the encampments, and then a largely silent and small group of students that actually were anywhere from skeptical of the protests to outright critical of them, but they only expressed these views in office hours. They didn't express them in sort of class discussion. And so that's kind of the context, right? Where I had both groups of students, sort of the more militant students and the sort of skeptical students, explicitly reach out to me asking for very specific things in support of their views, right? So I had some students asking me to cancel classes in support of the protests, and I had students asking me explicitly not to cancel classes. And so, I never experienced that sort of polarization, which makes it very difficult to preserve the type of classroom culture that I like to cultivate in the course of the academic term. And so in light of that, I sort of agree with all the panelists that, one can claim without much contestation that sociology is political, right? I mean, that we strive for knowledge and understanding, not as an end in itself, but as serving the moral goal of, at the very least, cultivating our students' kind of intellectual, ethical, creative capacities in the hope of equipping them to build a better world, right? A world that they want, a less harmful one. But I wonder, I would argue that that doesn't place sociology squarely in the realm of politics as the space for control over governance, or make the sociologist a straight up politician in the conventional sense of someone striving for power, right? Or control over the state machinery, drawing again on Edwin's reference to Weber. And I think that in the face of the skeptical student, which in my case were, again, a small subset of students who actually supported sort of the Israeli occupation, this distinction between sociology as politics and sociology as political is something to be valued and protected. Because if polarization, in the US and elsewhere has showed us anything, it's sort of the irrational character of politics, right? Motivated by feelings and myths about us and them. And I'd like to think that sort of as professional sociologists, our goal with respect to the skeptical student is persuasion, not defeat, right? So, and if that's the case, I would argue that our duty is to challenge the skeptical student and their beliefs with data, like Edward said, with sociological analysis writ large, with theory, with history, with all the tools at our disposal as a social science. But again, I think that's different from engaging them as enemies in a field of combat over power. Now, of course, I can anticipate many counter arguments to my view. I can anticipate some folks saying, the classroom is just one more social space, and white supremacy and injustices of all kinds can be reproduced there just as they can in any other social spaces. And of course, I agree with that. But I think that if your goal, right, if you start to frame the skeptical student as an enemy, and your goal is defeat rather than persuasion, as unlikely as persuasion may be, given what we know about as sociologists about the character of beliefs and how difficult it is to change people's beliefs when they're very tied to their sense of self, right? But again, if the goal is defeat, I think you'll be better served by the tools that are available to the politician, not to the professional sociologist, right? So I would say, I sort of agree with Edwin, and I'm wondering if he thinks that this interpretation or what I'm saying is kind of in line with what he's saying, that there is no higher sort of political responsibility than to confront students with data, evidence, and theory. And that includes noting the limits of that, right? Because there does come a point where sociological analysis sort of ends in the sense that there are uncertainties that you can't address with data and evidence and sociological analysis. And then at that point, you make the political decision, as Weber would say, do you move forward with your views and exercise power in the service of those views, which in our case is, presenting, I guess, in Ben's language, an expressive mode of politics knowing full well that you have power over students in the form of grading in other ways? And do you do that knowing that, your politics might be aligned, your moral compass might be aligned with a certain view, but you can't fully lay out the anticipated and unanticipated consequences of what might follow? Anyway, thank you again, and thanks to all the panelists for really provocative thoughts.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Edwin, I'll let you respond, but let's be mindful of time.
Yeah, I'll try and be very quick. Yeah.
I realize that we're getting close. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, thanks, Michelle. That's a very interesting comment. I mean, to me, I think the right wing is right to target sociology, meaning there is some fundamental truth to the fact that sociology is tied to liberal or left politics. But what they get wrong is that they think that tie is that students in the classroom are being asked to draw cartoons of Marx or write BLM all day in their notebooks, right? That is that they're being indoctrinated in some sort of simple sense, where the real link between, I think, sociology and what we could think of as, again, left or center left politics is that the objective of sociology is to denaturalize social processes. And that in itself is already a fundamental argument against social hierarchy. And therefore, you can follow the sort of line there, right? Now, I do think, in addition to that, just very quickly, that in this moment, in this particular moment of the US, the specific reactionary right wing is sort of growing and banking on a certain, for lack of a better term, a sort of the safe space sort of concept, right? In classrooms. Obviously, there's reasons for that concept to develop, but this is also, I think, a moment to understand, I think, what can be counterproductive about not developing argumentation skills. For example, assuming that because there is this symbiosis now with mainstream media, which is socially liberal, right, in a hegemonic way, that therefore you don't need to have arguments in defense of social liberal positions, right? And so the classroom, I think, in its political role can increasingly become that space in which that is discussed, of course, again, in falsifiable terms or scientific or terms and so forth. But that is in itself, to me, the political intervention of the moment, per se.
Thank you, Edwin. We're just on time, and so I won't be taking any more questions from the audience. I do want to thank you all for being here, all of the attendees, the panelists in particular. This far exceeded my expectations. I know you all, so I knew that it would be a great conversation, but I found it useful and I found it inspiring and I found it difficult, right? I leave with the thought that that we have a great responsibility, but I am heartened by the fact that my colleagues across the country are thinking so deeply about it. So thank you all for being here. And I welcome you all and all of you in the audience to read some of our reflections on First Publics, to sort of submit your thoughts. We are happy to work with you to sort of think through some of these questions, to pose the questions that came up here. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Good seeing you, Cedric.
Good
Bye.
seeing you.
That was
Bye-bye.
great. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Johnny.
Thanks.
Thank you all so much.